Hi there, mathematicians. It's Miss Johnson. Today we are going to be talking about a brand new concept. They're called ratios, and they're pretty simple. So we're going to take notes. So I want you to make sure you have your notebook ready. Your title is going to be Intro to Ratios, and make sure you put your date. So ratios are just us comparing numbers or comparing items. That's all it is. So ratios compare two items. So let's just compare something that we compare all the time. Let's compare the number of boys to the number of girls. All right, let's say that there are 2 boys to 5 girls. Sometimes it helps if we draw like a little pictorial representation of that. So if I was to do this as a pictorial representation, I would write 2 B's to represent 2 boys, and then I would write 5 G's to represent 5 girls. We're going to come back to that in a minute. There's 3 different ways to write a ratio. So right now we're comparing the number of boys to the number of girls. Right? So we're going to write that 3 different ways. And you see ratios done all 3 of these ways. So there's 3 ways to write ratios. We can write it just like we say it. So if I say, what's the ratio of boys to girls? We could write it just with that word 2. So we could say the ratio of boys to girls is 2, and then write the word 2 to 5. Or we can use a colon. So the colon is the 2 dots. But we say it the same way. Even though we write the 2 dots, we still say the ratio of boys to girls is 2 to 5. We don't say 2:5. We say 2 to 5. We can also write it as a fraction. We can also write it as a fraction. Now, this is in fraction form, but this is not a fraction because we know for a fraction that our denominator tells us how many pieces is in our whole. Well, girls is not our whole, right? Girls is a piece of the whole. So the ratio of boys to girls is not a fraction. Now, 2/5 will work just like a fraction. Like it will work exactly the same way. It's just not technically a fraction. We're just writing it like a fraction. Okay? All right, so there's 3 ways to write the ratios. And there's 6 different ratios that we can get from this one piece of information. So our information is the number of boys is 2 and the number of girls is 5. Well, we can write 6 different ratios from just that 2 to 5 ratio. Okay, so let's do that together. So we're going to write 6 different ratios. Some of them are very similar to each other. But they're technically different. Okay, so let's start with the one that the boys to girl ratio, the one that we started with, that is 2 to 5. We can flip that, and if we had written it in fraction form and we flip the numerator and the denominator, do you remember what we call that? Yeah, we call it the reciprocal. Okay, so the girls to boys ratio would be the number of girls compared to the number of boys. So one thing about ratios that's super important is that the order that you put the numbers in, it has to match the ratio that's being asked. Okay, so if they ask you what's the ratio of boys to girls, you have to make sure you put the number of boys first because they asked for the number of boys first. If they say what's the ratio of girls to boys, you have to put the number of girls first. It has to be in order because otherwise, if it doesn't match, how would you know which one is which, right? So it has to match the words, okay? All right, so we have boys to girls, girls to boys. Well, we could do boys to students or boys to total. So if we go back and look at our representation up here, our visual representation, right? We had 2 boys and then we had 5 girls. So our total would be, or we would have 2 boys out of how many? Yeah, 7. There's 7 people in that ratio. 2 boys, 5 girls. You could have also just said 2 plus 5 is 7. So our boys to total ratio is 2 to 7. So just like we can say boys to total, we can also say girls to total. Mm-hmm. So the number of girls is 5 to the total of 7. So the girls to total ratio is 5 to 7. Now the next 2 are almost just like the 2 that we just did. We're just going to flip the position. So instead of saying boys to total, we're going to say the total number of students to the number of boys. So the total number of students is 7 and the number of boys is 5. And then just like girls to total, we can, no, Miss Johnson, it's not 5 boys. Sorry, guys. It's only 2. All right, but the total to girls would be our 7 to 5. Okay, so we got 6 different ratios. They're technically different, even though some of them are just the flip, right? They're flip-flopped. The numbers are flip-flopped. But they're still technically different. There are types of ratios. There's 3 types of ratios, and we're going to look at these types from our example here. There's 3 types of ratios. The first type are the first 2. They're the 2 parts that make up the whole. So we call this the part-to-part ratio. Boys is a part and girls is a part, and they make the whole group of students, right? So this is a part-to-part ratio. Part to part. The 2 parts. The second 2, the boys to total and the girls to total, those are a part to whole ratio. So the total represents the whole thing. So we could have said students there, right? And that would represent whole as well. And then the last 2, yep, if boys to total and we just flipped it and said total to boys, and girls to total and we just flipped it and said total to girls, then guess what you think? Do you think what we would call this one? These 2. Yep, we would just flip it. We would say that's whole to part ratio. That's a whole to part ratio. So each type of ratio, there's 2 ratios that you can get from that. We've given us 6 different ratios altogether. All right, let's practice with one more. All right, let's say that, let's say that there's 10 desserts on the table. Let's say that 7 of them are pies. Yum. So what ratio is that right there? 10 desserts, 7 are pies. That's desserts to what? Desserts to pies. So that would be 10 to 7. Well, that is a what to what ratio. What type of ratio is that? Well, desserts is the total, right? And then pies is part. So what would the other part be? Well, the desserts are either pies or they're something else, right? They could be cookies or cakes or candy. So it's either pies or it's not a pie. So how many are not pies? So we could draw a picture of it. Or we could say 10 minus 7 is 3. So 3 are not pies. So our ratio that we would write here would be desserts to not pies. I guess we could have put other, right? Other desserts besides pies. So what that ratio would be 10 to 3. All right, so that's our whole to part. So let's do our part to whole. So we could have pies to desserts. So it's 7 pies to 10 desserts. Not pies to desserts. So we have 3 that are not pies to 10. So that would be our part to wholes. And then the last one would be our 2 part to parts. So the number of pies to the number that are not pies. So how many are pies? 7. How many are not pies? 3. And then just flip those. So the desserts that are not pies, 2 pies would be 3 that are not pies to 7. All right, let's go ahead and label them for our notes. So these are whole apart. Miss Johnson, spelling is terrible sometimes. At least I caught it. So hold apart. And then part to whole. Notice I didn't use total there, right? We used desserts, what we were actually talking about. But in our heads, we know that that is our total, right? So these will be our part to whole. And then part to part. All right, so what have we learned about ratios? Ratios compare 2 items. We can write ratios 3 different ways, with the word to, with the colon, or as a fraction. There's 3 types of ratio: part to whole, and whole to part. And those 3 types of ratio will give us 6 different ratios that we can write. And ratios are as easy as that, guys. We're going to practice with it some, and before you know it, you're going to be